Anyways, we started our discussion of the developmental state, and we showed you what the key features of a developmental state are. We said that when a government decides to actively intervene and guide the economy towards some development goals, and when it is willing to use all of its capacity, sometimes even break the democratic norms in order to achieve these objectives, it is called a developmental state. In other words, a state that is committed to bring about economic development according to an ideology or a vision to serve the public. So I showed you some examples of historical examples going back to 17th and 18th century of how even European countries in certain stages have acted like developmental states. Here is an example of a modern state, the country of Chile. In the period before it transitioned into a democratic society, we can see some examples of how government was very active in trying to promote economic development according to some targets. So here you can see the policies that were adopted by Chile in certain key areas. So in agriculture, for example, the government was active in food plan management, investments in that industry required significant amount of public expenditures for research, technical assistance, credit, building modern infrastructure related to agriculture. So you can see this was in period 1960 to 65. Then we come forward, you see the period where the government actually expropriated a large amount of agricultural land and used the land in order to carry out a land reform. It created divisions in land plots, in other words, taking very, very large land ownerships, redistributing part of it among farmers as smaller lands. What about forestry? Planting of trees, creation of industrial infrastructure, financing provided by government agency. The agency that was active in this area was called CARFO, or Corfo. Establishment of 5-year paths for the development of the Chilean forest to guide rural development, promote employment, and improve forest management. So again, an example of how the government of Chile in that time did not leave the production of agricultural products or forest products to the forces of market. It became actively involved in the process. And finally, from 1964 to 1986, granting of public subsidies to increase forest areas. So areas that had the potential, the government promoted planting of specific trees with commercial values and subsidizing the process so that it can go on. So you see examples of active government industrial planning and involvement. Industrial means any industry, in this case happens to be agricultural industry. So, in terms of outcome, what would be the macroeconomic evidence of a developmental state? Developmental states are committed to promoting economic growth, and if they are successful, they facilitate large amount of investment, which will result in a long period of good economic growth. So here we have some countries that have been identified in certain periods of time as developmental state. A developmental state has a time period. It could be, a country could be in that stage for several decades, or 1 decade, or a shorter period of time. So look at these examples. And what we have here, 2 columns that are of interest. One of them is gross domestic product, and you see that we have data for 2 time points, 2005, 2015. And the other one that's interesting is the gross capital formation, the amount of investment in fixed capital, machinery, buildings, infrastructure that is important for economic growth. So look at the average growth rate in this period. What do we observe in terms of average growth rate? Good numbers, correct? GDP average growth rate for this period of 15 years, China experienced an average of 10% growth. This is very exceptional for that period of time. Other countries, Singapore, for a 15-year period, growing at nearly 6% per year, that's quite significant. And you can see examples in Latin America. Again, these are not as remarkable as the Asian experience, but still, for 10, 15 years, growing at 3.5, 3.94% is a good achievement. And there are 2 examples in Africa in specific periods, Rwanda and Ethiopia. Again, periods of strong, sustained economic growth, so that on a 10-year period or a 15-year period, you can see the growth rate as being significant. And then, corresponding to that, look at the gross capital formation. Again, the data shows average annual growth of gross capital formation. The amount of investment. Investment is a key ingredient for continuous economic growth, because you need to increase your production capacity. It could be human capital, it could be machinery, buildings, infrastructure, and most of that in these countries is public sector investment, meaning that government itself directly invests a significant amount of money in the economy. Again, look at the statistics. Relatively good investment record in many of these countries. In some of them, such as Singapore or South Korea, we see that this record was better in 1990s compared to 2000. They are the countries that started their development state period earlier. That's why we observed that a record of higher number for them. But in all of them, the good record in terms of growth of investment, meaning capital formation, is visible in this table. Any questions about what we are observing? So, previous slide, specific policies for specific sectors. This slide is showing the macroeconomic picture, the big picture of what the economy experiences at the aggregate level during the development stage. 2 indicators: sustained economic growth and very strong investment in, very strong amount of growth in investment. To give you an example, here is the GDP of Rwanda. What we are observing is actually GDP, it should be GDP per capita. And you can see that, first of all, those of you who are familiar with the history of Rwanda, it experienced a very terrible genocide in the middle of 1990s, which is really part of the ugly side of human experience. But after that, there was a government that was able to bring about political stability, not necessarily democratic rule, but political stability. And that government happened to focus on economic development and economic growth, and you can see the result for the period of the first decade of the 21st century, relatively solid and strong economic growth. Okay. One of the most studied and noticed examples of developmental state is Japan. And is considered one of the first countries after World War II that has undergone or has gone through this period of developmental state. So we are going to look at some of the details of what happened in that country. So the industry had been destroyed during World War II. Practically most areas of Japan were severely bombed before Japan surrendered. After that, it had a democratic government that was imposed by the United States. And the Japanese accepted that government. And that government decided that it was committed to economic growth. Its first priority was economic development and economic growth. In order to achieve that, in order to promote industrial growth, the government took the lead. And the institution that was in charge of managing the industrial process in Japan was the Ministry of Trade, of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, that was established immediately after World War, 1949. So the primary goal initially was to direct the industries and create coordination among the private firms for specific industries. The government would set targets for production, it would facilitate technology transfer, and it would facilitate financial credit for that specific industry so that the firms could become competitive. And of course, the goal, the measurement of performance was not only production but export. Success of a corporation in Japan, an industrial corporation, was measured by its ability to export. Okay, so the 1950s. The broad objective was to catch up, industrial catch up, because there was a big gap between Japan and the standards of development, which were the United States and European countries. Production was encouraged, and of course, the favorable and positive attitude of the United States helped. The US wanted to see Japan and Germany to develop and industrialize so that their new model of democratic government would be successful. Promoting democracy was one of the primary goals of the United States, especially in the context of the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union in that period after World War II. So there was direct targets for industrial activity. The government would set quotas, recommend them, even though the production was taking place in the private sector. And of course, significant technological engineering support for the industries. So from the beginning, one of the key reasons that MITI was successful was that it had a professional and efficient bureaucracy, which was in close contact with the industry. It would learn about what industry needs, the corporations need. It would try to address their needs, and it would also at the same time provide guidelines for them. So that was a period of direct government leadership of production. The goals changed over time. As those industries matured and became more competitive, the government tried to change its role into indirect leadership and allow those corporations to take more initiative on their own. And what are we talking about when we talk about these corporations? We're talking about Mitsubishi, Honda, Toyota. All of these, if you read about them or ask your not parents but grandparents, initially as they started exporting products to the United States and Europe, the quality was not that good. But because of this focus of the Japanese government on improving the quality and making them competitive, gradually their quality improved, and by 1980s, in the United States there was a strong preference for Japanese cars and Japanese electronic products relative to domestic American-produced products. And they became so competitive that the US government imposed quotas on Japanese cars in order to save the American automobile industry. So you can see the transition that took place in Japan, starting with 1950s, with the very important role of MITI. Another function of MITI is that it would manage the transition of leading industry gradually to new industries. As the labor force became more specialized and more educated, Japanese government would abandon the production of certain products and say it's time to move to more advanced products. That transition, again, was done with the leadership of government as a developmental state. One of the instruments that the government had in order to create incentives for private sector and convince them to follow the lead of the government was that it had control over foreign exchange. So hard currency is very important for corporations in order to buy inputs for their production. And the government of Japan for a while had fixed exchange rate, and the government had the right to allocate exchange rate to corporations. They would use that as incentive based on your export performance. Just like giving loans, the access to credit and exchange hard currency was based on performance. But gradually Japan moved to floating exchange rate with the United States, and that reduced the ability of MITI to use exchange rate as a mechanism of incentive and control. But by then they were moving to indirect motivations and guidelines. Okay, so one of the activities that are very important for industrial development is transition from one type of product to more advanced product. And we see this happening in any country as the country goes through industrialization. Because initially your labor is unskilled, it is cheap labor, but as the economy grows and wages rise, some industries that are labor intensive, such as textiles, will no longer be competitive. That's where either the force of market or the government policy comes in, and the government says, we don't really want to have textile industry. We were competitive back then, but now we want to be in an industry which is more productive, because we want to see the wages rise and the standard of living for our citizens rise. You can't do that if you are producing something that is labor intensive and the wages of the labor are low. So what governments do is to transition, help the industry, the private sector industry, invest in new products which are more advanced and allow the wages to be higher. Okay? The model is called the model of when it happens among several neighbors. What happens is that you have a country like Japan that is initially producing textile because it's like in early stages of industrial development. Then the productivity increases and the labor becomes more educated, and the government says, now we want to move into a new industry. So they stop protecting the textile industry, allow for import of textiles, and encourage the private sector to invest in the steel industry. The country becomes competitive in steel. Production of textile will become non-competitive in Japan. It will go to another country, perhaps a neighboring country that has cheaper labor. Let's say it goes to Taiwan. Back then we are talking about 1950s, 1960s. So Japan has moved into a new product in concentration. Next decade, Japan says we want to go into electronics. And steel is no longer competitive. Our wages, we can generate more value added by moving into this advanced industry. They give the steel industry to Taiwan. Taiwan passes the production of textiles to another country with lower wages. So you can see how the production is continuously in transition. Countries do not maintain comparative advantage in one industry. The governments try to move the country forward into new technologies. Then what happens? Japan moves into video production. The television production is perhaps transferred to South Korea. South Korea itself was producing a steel that will go to Brazil. Let's say we're talking about global production, and so on. So there is a specialization in the supply chain of the global production. And countries, as they become more advanced, as the level of wages increase, they move into new industries. This is called the flying geese model of economic development. And the idea was presented first for Japan and its Asian neighbors. How Japan was the leading country, it would continuously move to new industries, and then Japanese firms themselves would invest and transfer the older industry into a new country. So what does that do? Government in any of these countries, as a developmental state government, if they agree with this process, they try to facilitate this. So let's say you are Taiwan. Japan is ready to pass an industry to you. It's the government that will create the infrastructure, create the incentives to receive investment, perhaps from Japanese or any other country for the industry that they are receiving. For example, let's say the country that now wants to focus on the steel industry. That requires government leadership. So that's one of the examples of how the developmental states function. In terms of Asia, Japan was the leader, began earliest, and then you had the newly industrializing countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then came the other countries that followed. Malaysia, Vietnam after 1975, when finally the Vietnam War was over. For a while it was a communist government, but that communist government changed its policies and joined the global supply chain by 1980s. Any questions about how this process works? So do you now see why, for example, you don't, when you go to buy clothing now, you don't see many clothes made in Taiwan. Not even so much made in China. Where are they made now?
Bangladesh.
Bangladesh is one of the leading centers for production. Because Bangladesh has an abundant, very low-cost labor. And textile garment has convention. And then you have Japan itself moving into computers, supercomputers, advanced technology, automobiles, things like that. This happens continuously under these models. And then when countries mature, then become industrial, they continue to produce a range of products. When we look at trade between the United States and Germany, what do we see? Do they specialize in something and sell it to each other? The answer is no. They trade on all industrial products. Correct? You have, take the example of automobiles. You have American cars being sold, produced and sold in Germany, German cars produced and sold in the United States. So we have bilateral trade on multiple numbers of industrial products in advanced stage countries. It's during the development process that countries, because of their cost of labor, specialize in an industry which is suitable for their cost of labor and level of education, the human capital of their countries. And of course, other things that might be an advantage. You might have a natural resource advantage, which determines what kind of products you will continue to produce. Okay. So to see how this works, look at these graphs. When we look at production experience of Japan, production of garments increases and then declines. Why is it declining? Steel is increasing. Production of steel and its competitiveness reaches a peak. Japanese wages keep rising. Therefore, they are no longer suitable for steel. It becomes less competitive. The steel industry starts investing in other countries which have cheaper labor. New electronic industries emerge in Japan, and this process continues. So if you look at one industry, you can see that that industry continuously migrates from country to country. Right. Okay, so now the question is, what is the role of government during this process? What are some of the specific activities that require government involvement and government management. And you can see them here. We're still talking about this process of flying geese in terms of transfer of technology from one country to the other, but this needs active government management. Because the countries' industries are continuously in transition. As you grow, the wages increase. As wages increase, some industries are no longer competitive internationally. And here we are talking about countries that face global export markets and international competition. So their goal is to export, and that's why they need to have a comparative advantage in an industry so that they can export. Okay. So the first task is to transition to new industries, which means that the government itself must decide, and often the developmental still does that. The government asks, what are new industries that we want to invest in? And then they move in that direction. Okay. Once you decide that, you need to coordinate among the firms. You need to identify which firms you would like to invite to be part of the group of firms that would receive government support for investing in that new industry. So that's the coordination of regional specialization. The second thing, especially in the case of Asia, we have seen this, is that the government of the developmental state must negotiate with the governments of other neighbors who are part of this process. They must negotiate, for example, to receive investment. As one country decides that they want to go into steel industry, they need the support of the country that is currently active in steel, but is moving out of that. So they try to attract that investment. Not only they do that, but when we look at the history of Japan's behavior and Japan's economic relations with, let's say, Taiwan, South Korea, you see that Japan itself, through negotiation with those governments, would say, I'm willing to invest in certain infrastructure for you, and I'm going to encourage our banks to invest in your projects for the steel industry. So in other words, Japanese firms become investors in a steel industry of, let's say, South Korea. All of that requires coordination among governments, regulations, especially regulations for attraction of foreign investment. That's what a developmental state does. It's an active player in this transition of industry. And that's why a country like Japan was so successful in improving the quality of automobiles, of course with attracting foreign investment, so rapidly that they were able to capture so many markets. And all the European and American auto industries were shocked in the 1970s by how rapidly they were successful. They need to encourage the domestic firms to participate in the regional supply chain. So another thing that happens is that this model tells you that each country, for example, is involved in one industry. Another thing that happens with advanced industry is that it becomes a multi-country global production process, because that is competitive. So take automobile industry. Let's say there are 5 or 6 key components in an automobile in terms of specific components that are part of that automobile system. Part of it is produced in Mexico. Part of it is produced in Taiwan. Some part in China. So every country now is part of the supply chain of a final industrial product. Apple, the phone that you receive. Again, several countries participate in production of that product, Apple iPhone, for example. So that means the government plays an important role in managing the multi-country supply chain. The new development is that the United States, which never had an active industrial policy or behaved like this, the US government was what we call a regulatory state. It simply designs the regulations and leaves the choice of industry or change of industry to the private sector. But past few years, starting in 2017, the US has become a developmental state. It is not only imposing restrictions, but it's also providing guidelines and resources to move the country, move the economy into certain specific industries. Can you give me examples of what the United States has been doing recently? What is Build It Better? President Biden's idea called Build It Better. So United States, or some conservative groups in the United States, woke up one day in around 2016, 2017, and realized that they thought China is going to be just producing labor-intensive products, and they were very happy that China was part of global economy. But they realized China is moving so fast that it is now moving into advanced products and even moving into technologies that in some cases is going ahead of the United States. So it was like a shock. And they said, no, we have to stop that. They imposed, for example, what is the one item that the United States has banned from China? There are many of them, but one of them is very famous, and is actively supporting production in the United States. Computer chips. They realized that we have been part of this global supply chain, and because of the high cost of labor in the United States, manufacturing in general, and even high-tech manufacturing, has moved to other countries. Now, if you want to have a global economy and open borders and open trade, which is something that the US has always promoted, you have to accept that and say we move to a new industry. There would be, for example, the US said they're going to move into high-tech finance, advanced financial services. But they said no. The government said no and became a developmental state. The government of the United States is starting in 2017, they're talking about now, said we want cheap production, we provide money, we provide incentive, and we protect the market for you. You want to sell chips in the United States, produce them here. Okay. Of course, the most important chips producer is which country? Taiwan. There is no competition for Taiwan. So now they are encouraging Taiwan to establish branches in the United States. And Taiwan says no, because if I bring my production to you, you're no longer going to fight to protect me because you don't need me. And then China will say you have been part of us forever. So that becomes the complication. Anyways, what I'm saying is that the concept of developmental state not only was popular in some developing countries, but with the advanced technology and technological change, even advanced countries like the United States are adopting some aspects of the developmental state. And of course, China is still a very active developmental state. We are going to see examples of that. Now, another important role of the state in this process is that in Asia, in particular in Asia, the economic activity has moved into regional specialization. Just like the graph that you see here, multiple countries participate in industrial activity. They are all export-oriented, and they each do some component part of the supply chain of this complex regional production. So an important role of the developmental state is to continuously negotiate with economic partners in the region. Taiwan negotiating with Korea, with Hong Kong, with Singapore, China, all of them, for management of these multi-country supply chains. Because so many products, the component is produced in Malaysia, one component in South Korea, they go to another country and assemble. So you need coordination. So the government becomes the coordinator, facilitator, making sure all of these take place smoothly. And then when it comes to specialization of what should be produced where, there is conflict of interest, correct? Every country wants the more advanced products to be produced in their country. So there has to be negotiations if you are going to have supply chain. Market can solve that, but these countries don't leave it to the market. The governments negotiate. What are some of the key ingredients that a developmental state needs, or some of the characteristics of the political institutions, bureaucratic institutions, that makes a developmental state successful? So, when you have a government that wants to intervene, it designs policy, it implements policy, it regulates, it's continuously interacting with the private sector, a good bureaucracy is very important. A professional bureaucracy that's meritocratic, meaning that promotion in the bureaucracy is based on qualifications. It's not based on connections, being relatives of politicians, having connections or having paid bribes. Not only based on good qualifications, but also a bureaucracy that has a good educational background, good skills in what it is supposed to do. In most Asian countries, even in Europe, bureaucratic jobs working for government is popular. That's not the case in the United States. In the United States, the graduates of top schools, what we call Ivy League, and they rarely ever like to go work for government. But in France, in China, in Korea, it is considered very prestigious to be employed in government at middle or top-ranking civil servant positions. And what they do, they hire some of the best students from top schools for the bureaucracy. As a result, the bureaucrats are professional, they are highly skilled, and when they provide public goods, when they provide government services of any kind, the quality and productivity of bureaucracy is very high. So that's very important. Another important feature of a developmental state is that the ideology of the ruling elite, whoever is in charge, or the group that's in charge, must be really focused on economic development. That is, there is no guarantee that the ruling elites necessarily care about economic development. Some of them might simply be interested in power for their own benefit. Some of them might be driven by an ideology which is not necessarily focused on development. It could be focused on military strength or an ideological bias towards a specific economic system, rather than saying what does it take to be pragmatic and be successful. Therefore, pro-business ideology among political elite is important. So at least you must have a group of people who agree that our focus should be on this ideology. Third, the ruling elite must believe that the key to their legitimacy is economic development, meaning that they could say, we are going to be successful if the economy is successful. Therefore, our goal is not only just for the economy, but for ourselves to maintain our rule. We need what we call developmental or economic performance legitimacy. This is important for non-democratic societies because in a democracy, it doesn't matter what kind of policy you adopt. When you are elected and people believe that the election was fair, you enjoy political legitimacy for the period of time until next election. When you do not have democratic elections and you are controlling either by support of military or by a small group, then what is your source of legitimacy? In developmental state, economic performance and increasing the standard of living of the society is viewed by the political elite as their source of legitimacy. This is what stabilizes the government. This is what creates social stability in Asian countries often. Now many Asian countries are democracies, but during the period that they were experiencing the developmental state policies, many of them were not democratic. Singapore, a very successful example of a developmental state. It has been there has been one single party that has dominated Singapore. So when we say monopoly corrupts, correct? Because when you are a monopoly, in what incentive do you have to serve the people? You can just enjoy all kinds of rents and benefits. Just 1 second. But, for example, in Singapore, even though you have a single party that has always dominated and others have been very minor, that single party has been fully committed to progress. And progress has been the source of legitimacy. So these three key factors, good bureaucracy, good ideology which is focused on economic development, and a shared belief among the elite that we don't have to go towards democracy to be legitimate leaders. All we need to do is to have good performance and our people see that their lives are improving on a daily basis. Year by year their lives are improving. That becomes our source of legitimacy. Thank you. Okay. So, let's go a little bit more into details of how this comes about. The first criteria was good bureaucracy, correct? So that requires a formal structure of bureaucracy. It also requires that the bureaucracy is insulated from political interference, so that rather than people at the top being appointed because of their political connections or because of their loyalty to the leader, simply being there to support the leader and make sure the organization is subordinate. They are there because of their merit and because of their technological skills, what we call technocrats, professionals who are apolitical, but from good schools with good skills in management, in engineering, and other skills that are required. And then, once you have a good bureaucracy, the key is that this bureaucracy provides good intervention. It does what is important to bring about economic growth in terms of identifying maybe weaknesses in the private sector, providing technological transfer, helping provide credit to the targeted industries that the government wants to promote, having a good set of import control and export promotion programs, so that when you want to promote an industry, you can reduce the competition against them a little bit, and you can create incentives for them to improve their productivity. Since in many of these countries, in addition to private industry, you also have large public enterprises that are engaged in production, they're in a way part of the government bureaucracy, and it's very important to find mechanisms so that the management of public enterprises are professional and the state enterprises, another name for them is public enterprises, are efficient. They are really able to carry out, produce products that can compete. So government often tries to protect the state enterprises in order to protect jobs. Then state enterprises become inefficient. Their goal is not to be competitive in global market in terms of what they produce, but simply create as many jobs as possible. That doesn't help economic growth in the long run. It just preserves jobs and employment. A developmental state moves away from that kind of policy and forces the state enterprises to also be efficient in what they do. Okay, what about pro-business ideology? What does that mean? Often in practice, the government tries to create an alliance and develop close cooperation between the government, bureaucracy, and large corporations that are involved in industrial production. So rather than government being in confrontation with business, the government becomes a partner in cooperation with business, because they share the same goal. For example, the targets of export promotion. So state implements a series of incentives and rewards to persuade domestic capitalists to invest in target industries, persuading, even if necessary, forcing them. So how is this achieved? Providing protection against foreign competition so that they have room to grow and be profitable. Use economic rent to bring about political stability. The government, often there is dispute between labor and businesses. Government would use its own resources to provide some kind of direct or indirect support for the labor, so that the labor is cooperative rather than going on a strike or causing disruption. It's also important to fight poverty so that the people under extreme poverty are not radicalized and going to extreme political groups that might engage in violence or acts of terror, which disrupts political stability. Reducing transaction costs. We talked about transaction costs. Good judiciary, a good dispute resolution, enforcement of property rights and contract laws, so that the cost of doing business goes down for your industries, and that becomes competitive. Now this is important, using rent to reward firms for productivity and competitiveness. So there is an incentive sometimes to provide subsidy to a firm that is losing money. Because all the firms come to the government and say, we have 50,000 employees, please help us or we'll have to lay them off. This recommendation says that's not the right thing. You should say, I'm going to look at your export performance. If you were successful in export during the year, I'm going to give you more credit and help you invest more. That forces firms into being competitive. And that's what we call using the rents. If government is going to provide any kind of subsidy, any kind of protection, remember we call these rents because it's the result of government policy. So we say the government would give these to firms that are performing better, not the firms that are ill and are underperforming. So this has some element of Darwinian competition. Yes, some firms are going to lose, but we care about those who are strong enough because we want them to compete in the global market. Okay, the rents here means profit opportunities that government has control over, such as providing subsidized credit, which should be done based on production performance, quality performance, and subsidy performance. Third one among those three is a shared belief that legitimacy of the government is based on economic success, economic development. So that shared belief is very important. It can come about sometimes as a result of national security concerns, where the ruling elite faces political rivals, and they come to the conclusion that unless we bring about economic growth and economic success, people are going to move towards communist movements and our regime would be in danger. So let's focus on economic success, industrialization. Let's make sure the industry is successful so that we can avoid that kind of outcome. Again, concern for poverty, which means that we share an agreement that we are going to fight poverty and eliminate it. As a result, industrialization will strengthen the political elite. How does that happen? When you are successful and bring about economic development and economic growth, government enterprises will generate more profits, which goes to the government. Industry pays more taxes. That means more resources for government. And that allows the government to have a larger bureaucracy, pay better wages, develop a larger army. So in a way, by bringing about economic success and industrial success, the government is serving itself. The political elite benefit from the success of the society. It's not that they're just benevolent, many of them directly would benefit. Okay, so then because of all of those three things that we said, political institutions are very important, the quality of political institutions. And that brings us back to the role of governance, significance of governance in developmental state. For example, when we talk about bureaucracy, and we want an efficient bureaucracy, we have to ask, what are the incentive structures? What are the incentive models that will encourage the bureaucracy to serve the industry and support the business, rather than becoming a burden or being indifferent? And here we're talking about maybe 3-4 million people who are in different ranks as civil servants. What do you do that a civil servant at the level that interacts with people and businesses really works hard, rather than just being slow, being unproductive? Because if you work less when you are a salaried employee, all you need to do is to come from, let's say, 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock. Whether you work hard or you don't work hard, you're going to get paid your salary, you have your insurance. This is where incentives in bureaucracy becomes important. Can you create incentives so that that civil servant feels like he would be better off if he does his job well and contributes to the success of the businesses that need his approval, for example, or need his signature for permission? It's very important to fight against corruption and abuse of political power. How can you have mechanisms to identify and prevent corruption? Political authority must be used to suppress demands for redistribution and allocate more resources to investment and capital formation. What does this mean? What is the meaning of this? It's not a pleasant thing. You imagine you have workers that are not well paid. You want them to work hard. They want to mobilize and demand higher wages. Now, higher wages, when you are producing for export, means that you have to increase the cost of production, and that means the price of your product in international markets goes up. That reduces your competitiveness. What do governments do if they are not democratic? They suppress demands for higher wages and more benefits by some labor groups. This is not democratic. This is authoritarian, it is repressive, but they do that so that the industry is competitive globally. And then as productivity comes up, at a later stage they bring up the wages. That can't be done in democratic societies. What is about to happen? A major strike is going to take place in the United States. What is it? You haven't followed the news? Please follow the news occasionally. National Public Radio, NPR, once in a while listen to it. The longshoremen, what we call the dock workers, are going on a strike. Every day, millions of tons of products come to U.S. shores by ship. Cargoes from all over the world. They must be unloaded. Products must be loaded on ships for transport. The workers that do that are about to go on a strike. I think the negotiations have failed. I believe yesterday was the beginning. If you follow the news, you can see that. It is going to be very disruptive. And the government has laws to interfere. But legally, in a democratic society, they have the right to do that. Developmental states, especially those in Asia, at some point, many of them did not have to bother about democracy. They used the force of government to suppress labor demands for redistribution, for better wages. So if you do that just to enrich yourself, that is called predatory political behavior. When the political leaders prey on people, keep them poor for their benefit. But the developmental state does that to keep the industry competitive in order to win export markets. So Korea, Singapore, Vietnam, all of these countries at some stages have suppressed labor demands. They have imprisoned labor leaders, but for the benefit of the economy in the long run. In many countries, in China for example, you cannot go on a strike. It is not free to go on a strike to demand something. So your bargaining power as workers is limited. And finally, coordination among some social and economic actors inside the country. That coordination role is also very important. Not only interactions of government with the industry, but coordination among industry, among various groups in society, so that you can persuade some groups to be part of this big developmental process. So it's not always just repression. Part of the reason that you have what we call peace in the production process, meaning labor peace and labor cooperation with management, is the ability to achieve coordination. So one example of all of these things is this leader in Korea. The period of 1963 to 1979, this is Park Chung-hee, well known in Korean history. He is associated with developmental state. An example of things that he did when he came to power. He arrested the heads of some of the major businesses in Korea, charged them with corruption. Governments can always find things to charge someone with corruption, especially when you are a leader of a major industry. And then he said, this is the important key fact. He said, all right, but I'm not going to send you to jail. You are leaders of businesses. Here are my target industries. If you agree to invest in that industry, I will not send you to jail. It's non-democratic, but he was a military leader. He came to power with the support of Korean military, ruled as an authoritarian leader, very powerful, but used his power to sort of coerce and co-opt the businesses to coordinate them towards export-oriented industries. And the industries that, industrial groups that he brings together, there is a name for them, Cheobal or Chaebol. Maybe you have heard of it. Do we have anyone who speaks Korean from South Korea? We don't have anyone. Yes, Chaebol is the groups of industries that government brings together for a specific targeted production, and government interacts with them. So he used authoritarian power to support the developmental state. That's how developmental states have worked. In certain periods, they have ignored democratic rules. So you could have authoritarian leaders that might do some good things for their society, or authoritarian leaders that extract resources from the society for themselves and their supporters. There is always this debate that could countries like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Indonesia, for example, would they have been able to achieve their industrial success if they were democratic and if they did not have authoritarian leaders. When we look at the political tendencies in these countries, often you had deep divisions of ideas, some people gravitating towards communism, some people capitalism, and when there was freedom, you would have this massive, sometimes violent competition among various groups. Authoritarian leaders, if they are benevolent, they suppress all of that competition, they ban political activity, they force the society to use its energy towards production so that the country as a whole can act as one corporation competing in the global